I want to talk about what needs to happen after you've crossed the line of faith and become a Christian in order to become Christ-like, to truly engage the Christ life, to truly develop yourself spiritually, if you've chosen the Christian faith, because it is about development. It's really not that different than developing yourself physically. If you want to develop your physical life, you invest in activities and pursuits that go to work on your body. A developed spiritual life also contains certain exercises, and we're going to explore some of them in this series. Some of them you may have never even known about. But I need to warn you that there is an important distinction between spiritual development and other areas of self-improvement. If I work out to improve my physical life, I'm being physical. If I engage in a book discussion group or take a college class to develop myself intellectually, I'm being intellectual. That isn't the case when it comes to our spiritual life. Spiritual exercises are not the same as being spiritual. By themselves, spiritual activities lead to nothing but lifeless religion. The heart of authentic Christian spirituality is relational. It is not institutional, nor is it even particularly necessarily experiential. True Christian spirituality is a developed intimacy with God, which results in an ongoing transformation into the likeness of Christ. So let's jump in. And where I want to start with this series, before we get into the actual ways that you develop yourself, I want to have some time where I just clear away some myths and clear away some deceptions about developing yourself spiritually. So before we get into making a to-do list of sorts, let's make a not-do list. Before we get into what you need to know, let's get into what you might need to unknow. Because when it comes to what should happen after you believe, there's a lot of lies that we cling to. So let me kind of cover some deceptions, and then let's get into some outright lies. First with deceptions. I want to give you a couple of specific ones, but the big idea, if you're going to understand the nature of almost all deceptions related to spiritual growth and development, you have to understand that in truth, there is no such thing as a spiritual life. There's just life, and it's meant to be lived spiritually. That's not particularly original with me. It's been the headline for what the Christ life has been about for over 2,000 years. The very word Christian means little Christ, meaning someone who is living the life Jesus lived. So your spiritual life is not a component. It's not a pocket. It's not an area of your existence. It's meant to permeate every fiber of your being. You don't have a spiritual life over here. You have a life that is spiritual. You have a life that is being transformed increasingly into the likeness of Jesus. This means that the great overarching spiritual deception is thinking that the appearance of spirituality is spirituality itself. Let me give you the two big substitutes for authentic spirituality that are the most deadly. And the first deadly deception is the deception of religion. Now, the deception of religion is thinking that when we go through certain religious rites or rituals or membership processes, or we attend certain services or ceremonies, we are being spiritual. The name for this is legalism. Legalism is following do's and don'ts and putting do's and don'ts on ourselves to follow in the name of God that God did not put on us. It's a religion of added rules and regulations and standards and stipulations and codes and conduct, often contrived by someone to determine who is and who is not spiritual. It's being asked, if not forced, to measure up in a way that can be binding and brutal and discouraging and defeating. And it feels about 1,000,000 miles away from anything authentic and life-changing and freeing. And it should feel 1,000,000 miles away from that because it's a deception. This is what set up the tension between Jesus and the religious teachers and leaders of his day, the teachers of the law and the group known as the Pharisees. They were very religious, and they were considered to be the holiest people of the day. They had taken the Old Testament and calculated that it contained 248 commandments and 365 prohibitions, and they lifted out every one of those and vowed to follow every one of them and wanted everybody else to follow them. And just to make sure, this was what really got kind of toxic about it even more, to make sure they didn't break one of those rules, They made rules about the rules and laws about the laws. They came up with over 1,500 editions of do's and don'ts. That's not Christian spirituality. Christianity is not about reducing life to rules and regulations. It's not about religion. It's about a relationship. Which brings us to a second deadly deception, the deception of knowledge. This is the idea that all you have to do is to know and believe the right things, have head knowledge, intellectual assent, embracing Christianity on a philosophical level. But knowledge alone is meaningless. I can believe in a lot of things, but that doesn't mean those beliefs impact my life, much less reflect my life. As Thomas Kelly once observed, the heart of spirituality has less to do with knowledge about than it does acquaintance with. This was my deception before I became an authentic Christ follower. I had a lot of knowledge, but no intimacy, no relationship, no acquaintance with. Many people claim to believe in Jesus, but true belief is more than just saying that you accept the facts. Believing is giving your life over to what you say you believe. Believing is commitment. This is talked about in the Bible in very direct terms in the New Testament letter of James. He says, does merely talking about faith indicate that a person really has it? Do I hear you professing to believe in the one and only God, but then observe you complacently sitting back as if you had done something wonderful? Well, that's great. Demons do that, but what good does it do to them? Use your heads. So how do you experience an authentically spiritual life? If those are some of the deceptions, and you want one, though, that results in a life change that reflects the Jesus you follow, well, let's talk about how you don't. So let's move from the deceptions to the myths. We got more stuff to clear away. So let me give you 4 or 5 myths about life change. The first one is what I'll just call the instantaneous myth. Deep, lasting life change does not often happen at the moment your relationship with God begins. When you begin your relationship with God, your eternal destiny is altered. You experience a radical reorientation of priorities, a new life purpose. The power of God takes up residence in your life. But rather than instant communion with God at the deepest of levels, you experience the beginning of a new relationship that develops in intimacy and depth over time to the degree that you pursue it. And also, rather than the immediate liberation of every bad habit or character flaw you've ever possessed, the experience is more like an army that lands on a beachhead and then begins routing out the enemy as it makes its way inward. This is why the Bible gives us this reminder. It says, let your roots grow down into him and draw up nourishment from him. See that you go on growing in the Lord and become strong and vigorous in the truth you are taught. Now, I want you to look at that verse for just a moment. Notice something about it. The language is important. You have to let your roots grow. You have to draw up nourishment. You have to keep on growing. You have to become strong and vigorous. You see, spirituality isn't something that just happens. It's something to be nurtured, and you have to be intentional about that nurturing. Becoming a Christian is just the beginning of the journey. It's the start of a life that follows Christ, and that life is meant to deepen and grow. Okay, that's the first myth. Second one, while Christianity is a journey, it's not merely a journey. So let's just call it the time myth. The myth that true spirituality is simply a byproduct of time. That's not the way it works. Being a Christian does not automatically translate into becoming Christ-like. That's why you can meet 2 people who have both been a Christian for 5 years, and one of them seems very mature and advanced, and the other one does not. A 5-year-old Christian does not necessarily have 5 years worth of spiritual maturity. Simply being exposed to something has little bearing on whether we are becoming proficient at it. So the same way with our spiritual lives. It takes time, but it's not simply a byproduct of time. The writer of the book of Hebrews put it this way, and he was actually writing to a group of Christians. He said, though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you the elementary truths of God's word all over again. Now, I'm sure that stung when they read it, but it can be true of us, can't it? I can be exposed to any number of Christians and dynamics of Christian culture, but not be affected by it. Yet I can be deceived into thinking I have been. Well, if there's the instantaneous myth and the time myth, let's talk about the effort myth. That spiritual growth is just attained by trying. The idea is that people must simply decide to be spiritual, kind of like a New Year's resolution, because spiritual living is essentially an act of the will. So love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control, all are believed to be matters of just raw effort. Now, while spiritual development does demand intentionality, merely trying to experience life change can never bring about life change. The heart of Christian spirituality is to be like Jesus. And to be like Jesus, you don't try either. You train. You do the things that Jesus did in order to live the life that Jesus lived. And that's why Jesus once said, everyone who is fully trained will be like his teacher. And the Apostle Paul later wrote, train yourself to be godly. I've always thought the words of Dallas Willard on this were well put. He wrote, anyone who is not a continual student of Jesus and who nevertheless reads the great promises of the Bible as if they were for him or her is like someone trying to cash a check on another person's account. The key to a spiritual life is to order your life around those activities and those disciplines and those practices that were modeled by Jesus in order to accomplish through training what you cannot now do simply by trying. Which leads to a fourth myth, that a personal relationship with God through Christ is synonymous with a private relationship with God through Christ. Let's just call this one the solo myth. 2/3 of all Christians right now don't think they need anyone in their life to help them walk with God. 2 out of every 3 have bought into the solo myth. The truth is, becoming a truly spiritual person, you need to be on a team. It's a team sport. And this insight is taught all throughout the Bible. In Proverbs, we read that as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. The writer of Hebrews said, let us consider how we may spur one another on toward loving good deeds. And let us not give up meeting together, meaning individually, relationally, as Christians, having Christian friends and Christian support groups. Let's not give that up, as some are in the habit of doing, but let's encourage one another. Throughout the Bible, in the life of those who really develop their faith, you just see strategic relationships, whether it's lifelong or for a season. They had people. Well, the final myth that I'll throw out is one you'll want to remember throughout the course of your entire life. Let's call it the transformation myth. This is the idea that transformation is an achievement. It's something you attain, or it's like a light switch. Once you flip it on, it's just on. The truth is that it will often be a process for the rest of your life of 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. It's kind of like, the law. It's called the Law of Undulation. To undulate means to move in waves, to go up and down in terms of your progress. Now, hopefully, if you look over the course of your life, that undulation has at least something of an upward incline, but make no mistake, this is how human beings are when it comes to the spiritual life that we're pursuing. It's the nearest thing that we have to normalcy. And not only is it true in terms of actual growth, but in terms of how you will feel spiritually. A lot of people believe that, true spirituality is gauged by feeling. Do I feel close to God? Do I feel spiritual? And so they often reduce their spiritual life to going to one spiritual pep rally after another because they've got to kind of somehow keep up this feeling. The reality is that authentic spirituality, while a dynamic enterprise that involves your entire being, has more to do with how you respond to your emotions than it does your current emotional state. There's going to be times you feel up and down, or down, high or low, but in truth, your feelings have very little to do with the actual state of where you are with God. The key idea is becoming a disciple. In Christian circles, we often talk of discipling someone, being discipled, or going where there is a strong emphasis on discipleship. That sounds good on the surface, but I think the problem is that we often don't know what we're talking about when we say disciple. Yes, the heart of it is becoming a disciple, but let's understand what that is. Most of the time when people use that word, it means going where you will be spoon-fed or bottle-fed. Somebody is actively teaching and you are passively taking notes, and somebody is discipling you, which means how it affects you is based on whether or not they are a good discipler, or whether the church is good in terms of discipleship or strong in terms of discipleship. In other words, discipleship is something that happens to you. It is something that you receive, which is why people talk about going where they can be fed or complaining that they aren't being fed. Discipleship isn't really about them. It's about something that is supposed to happen to them and to come to them from outside of themselves. There's an active discipleship force, and they are the passive recipients. Well, if that's the way it works, why aren't more people disciples like we read about in the Bible? It's because that's not how discipleship worked, and that's not what discipleship is about. The word disciple is from the Greek word mathetes, and it literally means a learner. The whole idea of a learner is that it puts the action firmly into the lap of the one who is doing the learning. The point is that you, as a disciple, as a learner, are to be actively engaged in learning. It is your responsibility to take up the mantle of self-development. Think about how this worked with Jesus. He invited a very select group of men and women to do life with him for approximately 36 months. Formerly, there were the 12 disciples. There were also women such as Mary and Martha and Mary Magdalene that he invested in as well. Theirs was an invitation to learn, not to enter into a passive process of being fed. We certainly know that not all of the 12 went to school on Jesus. One in particular didn't seem to learn much of anything. If discipleship was simply something done to you or for you, or just passively sitting while someone is teaching, Jesus failed epically as a discipler. I mean, does anyone, with Judas, that was an epic fail, if that's your definition. But does anybody want to say that Jesus was not a good discipler? Then get that understanding of discipleship out of your head. Just get it out. Here's the truth about being a learner. Growing spiritually is something that can be served by other people, but ultimately has to be owned personally by us. This is so important to get down. Too many followers of Christ view discipleship as something that is done to them and for them. And it's almost like they go around searching for when they're going to get that, where that next injection, almost like a personal enrichment program or finding just the right life coach. No. That's why in the New Testament book of Hebrews, we're told that people who keep looking to get fed that way are actually in arrested development. They're like babies who never grow up. They're always wanting their bottle, because the mark of maturity is not being fed, but feeding yourself. If you think I'm being a little sarcastic or snarky in how I paraphrase it, let me read it to you so you can hear it yourself. He says, "We have much to say about this, but it is hard to explain because you are slow to learn. In fact, though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you the elementary truths of God's word all over again. You need milk, not solid food. Anyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is not acquainted with the teaching about righteousness. But solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil." The heart of the challenge is for you to become an active, self-motivated, self-feeding learner, which means you're going to have to make an investment. Think of a mutual fund. You open the fund with an initial investment, say you put $100 in there. If that's all you ever do with the amount of growth in your mutual fund, it'll be very minimal and very slow. You've got to make continued investments in that fund to move forward and really have the magic of compounding interest really kick in, begin to generate the kind of dividends and growth that you desire. Or more to the point, think of a new relationship. Maybe you meet at a party or something and you had instant chemistry and you found that you had a lot of shared interests and passions. But if you never connect with that person outside of that one-time meetup, or at best sparingly, then the promise of that relationship will never reach its potential. You can become a Christian and never become a disciple. You can begin a life in Christ and never develop it. And that would be a tragic thing. You need to cooperate with God's leading and direction in your life. And you need to make the necessary investments to position yourself for his ongoing work in your life.